Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, August 17th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And I have to tell you that I might be interrupted because today is our wedding anniversary and people are calling, but we'll work that out. The first article, I usually don't read sports articles, and this is really only tangentially a sports article. It's about the new stadium that we all paid for. And it's called Bills Respond to Criticism Over Poor Sightlines at New Highmark Stadium. This is by Adam Coleman and Tim Graham. When a football stadium costs $2.2 billion with $850 million from taxpayers, and the team mandates personal seat licenses for the first time in Buffalo sports history, a clear view of the field should be essential. That wasn't the case when some Buffalo Bills fans arrived Saturday for Highmark Stadium's public unveiling. The Bills say they've heard from only a minuscule number of season ticket holders who were disappointed with their seats, though jarring images spread across social media after the Bills opened the new stadium to patrons for the first time at Saturday's red and blue practice. Fans posted photos of their sightlines blocked by railings, cable wires, and stair landings. Some posted side-by-side pictures illustrating starkly different sightlines compared to what they were promised during the personal seat license process. While the controversy led evening newscasts around Buffalo, the Bills promised to address whatever issues they could, but also stood by their sales methods as transparent. So far, we've heard from less than 1% of our PSL holders about anything sightline related, said Bills President of Business Operations, Pete Gully. Relative to the specific issue, we feel very confident that what was represented via the virtual venue is accurate to what people saw when they sat in their seats. If anybody feels otherwise, we're taking this on a case-by-case basis and will address any concerns that they have. Given advancements in architecture, engineering, and technology, it would be fair in 2026 to expect zero obstructed views in what should be, until the next one opens, the NFL's showpiece stadium. But all stadiums will compromise seating to accommodate design concepts. As for the images of sightlines blocked by fans and vendors constantly walking and gawking during the action, Senior Vice President of Venue Operations and Fan Experience, Andy Major, pointed out that Saturday night was a practice. The Bills will maintain a wait for the whistle policy during games, with ushers holding back passersby until play stops. Other complaints from Saturday night's open practice focused on the size of the video scoreboards, poor stadium audio, and a downpour that left sections of fans drenched, even though they paid to be under the canopy. Highmark Stadium's marketing materials boasted that nearly 65% of the seats would be covered. We're learning a lot about the building, a little too late, and that includes game presentation. We'll look at how much of the scoreboard we're using for video versus using for content. We also have things in this building that we didn't have before. We have a 9-foot ribbon board right below that scoreboard that we may want to use differently. But with the raw size of the scoreboards, we're comfortable and confident that those are the way we intended and designed them. Many attendees were upset about traffic entering and leaving the stadium, but there's only so much the Bills can do to address that. It'll take time for fans and law enforcement to learn best practices for so many new parking lots and traffic patterns. It was an amazing, incredible night, said the vice president. The reaction that we got from the vast majority of fans has been overwhelmingly positive. It's a state-of-the-art, best-in-class facility. Nothing in that building compares to the old stadium, and I think for the most part, people were blown away. Now, on a serious subject. I guess that's serious too if we paid for it. Buy now, pay later lenders pitch loans for needs like electricity and rent. And this is by Stacy Cowley. Buy now, pay later loans took off during the pandemic as a way for online shoppers to go on retail splurges without using a credit card. Now lenders are offering the loans as a means for people to finance basic household needs. The lending apps Flex and Zip allow customers to take out loans to pay for their broadband, electricity, health insurance, mobile phone service, mortgage, and water bills. Affirm, one of the most popular pay later apps, has started providing some tenants loans to extend their monthly rent payment for a few weeks. Many dentists, veterinarians, and medical clinics now often offer instant pay later financing, and Intuit this year started promoting file now, pay later loans to TurboTax users who owe money in their tax return. Pay later loans are becoming the working capital for the modern middle class, said Karen Webster, the chief executive of Payments, a news and market research company for the payment industry. Consumers are using it more for essential everyday things. The rise in pay later financing comes as many households are leaning more on debt to keep up with their daily expenses. Paying interest to afford basic needs adds to the overall cost of living, which has already been rising amid higher medical, housing, and fuel costs. Americans spent $160 billion last year through pay later loans, according to research recently released by Federal Reserve economists, nearly twice what consumers spent 2 years earlier in 2023. That's still a fraction of the more than $3 trillion that U.S. shoppers spend annually on consumer credit cards, but the industry continues to expand by double-digit rates every year. For many borrowers, these loans have become their only option. Half of those using them said they could not make ends meet otherwise, according to the latest edition of a survey that LendingTree has compiled for years. The loans address the real needs that people are short of funds, but just adding fees to their monthly budget and leaving them short next week is not the answer, said Lawrence Saunders, a senior attorney at the National Consumer Law Center. How much of the growth reflects consumer preferences versus desperation is a question economists and industry analysts are trying to unravel. Some shoppers with access to other credit deliberately choose pay later loans. Some prefer the loan's short repayment terms and see their fees as more transparent than those on credit cards, where interest rates fluctuate and a single late payment can trigger penalties. The pay later loans can be obtained immediately. Customers typically download an app, connect it to a bank account or debit card, and can then immediately start spending. The loans, which are generally offered by financial technology merchants rather than banks, usually have repayment terms of just a few weeks or months, and they carry fixed fees. Many lenders do not charge late fees and simply freeze the credit lines of borrowers who fall behind. But the pay later loans can also become debt traps, especially when borrowers stack them up. A quarter of those surveyed by LendingTree who used the loans said they had at times had 3 or more loans outstanding at once. And because pay later loans often pull their payments directly from customers' bank accounts or debit cards, one mistimed withdrawal can set off a cascade of overdraft fees and other missed payments. Ashley Reed, 40, initially used pay later loans for small indulgences. Then a family emergency upended her finances. Her mother had a brain aneurysm, hours away from their home in Baltimore. Ms. Reed maxed out her credit cards paying for emergency care, including an ambulance trip not covered by insurance and a hotel room near her mother's hospital. Loans from Afterpay, Klarna, and other merchants became the only way she could keep up with her electric bill, auto insurance and repairs, and other essentials. Now she spends about $700 a month paying down the debts and then borrowing more on her pay later loans to stay afloat. It's a roller coaster ride, up and down. I can't afford to have an emergency, she said. Sometimes I'm like, okay, am I going to have enough for groceries? Ms. Reed, who works full-time as a public school paraprofessional and picks up weekend shifts as a part-time hospital radiology assistant, reported her financial struggles in a survey conducted by her union, the American Federation of Teachers. More than a third of those polled said they could not afford to pay all of their monthly bills, and thousands reported borrowing from credit cards, pay later loans, friends, family, to get by. Pay later companies pitch their loans as an alternative to more punitive options. Missing a rent check can lead to late fees or eviction, and charging daily purchases on a credit card can trap consumers in years-long cycles of mounting debt. Affirm describes its expansion into rent financing as a pilot project. It will advance only one rent loan at a time. Customers cannot borrow again until their previous month's debt is paid. The offering is a way to give people, especially those with incomes that fluctuate, like gig workers, some certainty when they need it, for whatever reason, even if that's just one time, said John Pitts, the company's vice president of public policy. The lender's own marketing materials illustrate the dire choices their customers can face. Cherry, based in San Francisco, is an instant loan company for medical and dental practices. The case studies section of its website spotlights some grim scenarios. One dental clinic noted that most of its customers arrive in acute pain and need emergency treatment that they often cannot get without taking out a Cherry loan. Another concern about the explosion of pay later lending is the way it largely exists outside the mainstream credit ecosystem, creating hundreds of billions of dollars in consumer debt that isn't captured in traditional economic analyses and snapshots. FICO, the credit score giant, announced in mid-2025 that it would soon launch 2 new credit scores that would incorporate pay later loan data. But most pay later lenders do not report their loans to credit bureaus. A year later, FICO's new scores still have no release date. FICO said it was waiting until lender data was sent to the credit bureaus at scale before its scoring models could be tested and adopted. That creates a blind spot sometimes called phantom debt, much of it held not by banks, but by private credit firms that operate in the less regulated shadow banking system. Economists are keeping a sharp eye on the industry's size. An analysis last year by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond deemed the threat of systemic risk limited, but warned that these risks could amplify if left unchecked. Industry leaders bristle at the idea that their loans are riskier for individual customers or the broader economy than other credit products. They cast their expansion into financing routine expenses like housing and utility bills as a prudent response to market demand. Flex, founded in 2019 and based in New York, has financed nearly $40 billion in rent payments for 3 million tenants. Its customers have a median credit score under 600, the territory generally ranked as poor and subprime. About a third use Flex every month. The rest dip in only occasionally. Flex charges a $6 monthly fee plus a charge of 3% of the sum that's borrowed and a processing fee. This year, the company expanded its financing into a broader set of recurring monthly expenses, including utilities and auto loans. Flex described its fixed fees as a simple and safe system. It does not charge late fees or compounding interest, and customers cannot borrow again until their rent debt is paid off. But even the lenders themselves acknowledge that their products and their rapid growth are a sign of the growing economic strain many households face. Said Ryan Metcalf, Flex's vice president of public affairs, "We can't solve income or the price of rent and affordability. What we can do is help people solve a timing issue. It's harm reduction." And here's an important story. As Iran truce expires and options shrivel, Trump lashes out. This is by Luke Broadwater. As a crumbling truce with Iran officially collapsed on Monday, Trump signaled his frustration at his inability to resolve a war that he started but cannot seem to end. In an interview with Fox News, the president lashed out at an American ally, Oman, that has been trying to mediate negotiations with Iran. Trump said, "If Oman gets in the way, we'll bomb the shit out of them." The latest threat toward Oman, which has facilitated talks between the U.S. and Iran for years and maintains that it is still a neutral mediator, came as Trump found himself without much leverage to reach the goals he set out at the start of the war. Said Nate Swanson of the Atlantic Council's Iran Strategy Project, I think ultimately his threats against Oman are just a reflection of his frustration with the situation he's created, where he has no good options. He's just reflexively lashing out, and this time Oman got in the crosshairs. Quick pause, you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Hostilities have now stretched past the 6-month mark in a conflict that began with the U.S. and Israel launching strikes across Iran in February. Administration officials pledged at the time that the war would be over in 4 to 6 weeks. On the battlefield, the U.S. has struck thousands of targets in Iran and dealt serious blows to the country's military capabilities, but the president has struggled to achieve the war's political objectives. In June, the two sides agreed to a memorandum of understanding, but that quickly fell apart. Both Trump and Iran's leaders have said the deal is essentially dead. It's mostly symbolic, but symbols matter, said Justin Logan, the Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He emphasized that the main function of the agreement was to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the critical shipping lane in the Persian Gulf that Iran effectively closed during the war. He said the tragic part here is that the U.S. is clawing to try to get back to the state of the Middle East before the war started. As the ceasefire officially expires, the president and his team have promised to level crushing sanctions against Iran this week, though the details of those plans have yet to be unveiled. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has said the United States can maintain a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz indefinitely, an acknowledgement that there was no end to the war in sight. In the Fox News interview, Trump sought to project patience, saying he was not in a hurry to secure a deal, while maintaining that his central goal remained preventing Iran from possessing a nuclear weapon. Speaking to the reporters in the Oval Office, Trump was asked whether he was any closer to ending the war now than he was when the memorandum of understanding was agreed to. He didn't directly answer, but claimed that Iran wants to make a deal, but they're not going to make the kind of deal I feel is necessary. He added, look, we're in there for one reason. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Trump also downplayed concerns that sailors on the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln have been deployed for too long with conditions worsening. The ship is supporting U.S. operations in the Middle East against Iran. Trump called reports of food shortages on the ship fake news. The Lincoln has been out there for a period of time, good period of time, but over the years we've had him out there much longer, he said. He also said the U.S. could declare the Strait of Hormuz a territory of the United States. We control it with the blockade, and I like the idea of declaring it a territory, he said. But it was Oman that received the president's fury on Monday. Iran has said it has been holding talks with Oman on temporarily reopening the strait. Trump said, I don't think Oman behaved very well, but we'd handle them very easily, just like we do other things. It was the second time this year the president has threatened that country. In May, it emerged that Oman had discussed working with Iran to charge fees for ships to pass through the strait. Trump told reporters then, Oman will behave just like everybody else or we'll have to blow them up. They understand that. They'll be fine. A White House official did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Mr. Swanson said he believed the president has several options to try to resolve the war. He said the U.S. could continue with a policy of what Trump has called low-key economic pressure, which has thus far not provided results. Ramp up a military campaign against Iran, even as U.S. munitions stockpiles dwindle, or return to negotiations to produce a deal similar to the one both sides already abandoned. Or, he said, Trump could wash his hands completely of the entire war and ask Gulf allies to get more involved in the Strait of Hormuz. Mr. Swanson said, I'm wondering if at some point, either by choice or incompetence, we kind of just put our blinders on and let the Gulf figure it out. And here's an interesting article. A hopeless diagnosis, not for this patient. And this is by Gina Colata. Nina Nizar is tiny, just 3 feet 9 inches tall. Her arm bones curve inward just above her wrists and elbows. Her ribs are bent, her neck bones are bent, her skull is bent. She uses a wheelchair and suffers from constant pain, but she's energetic, enthusiastic, and charismatic. For 10 weeks this summer, she lived in a hospital room at the National Institutes of Health as the one and only participant in a study of an experimental drug for her rare genetic disorder, which is called Jansen's disease. Only 30 people in the world are known to have Jansen's, and 3 of them are Ms. Nazar and her 2 sons. She's not expecting to be cured during the trial. Jansen has distorted her bones to the point of no return. But if the experimental drug works as expected, the next participants in the study will be children. The hope is that it could protect them from Jansen's debilitating effects. Were it not for Ms. Nazar, the trial would never have happened, a case study of the often Herculean efforts required to get the necessary attention and funding to explore treatments for a rare disease. Her extraordinary story is less a roadmap for other patients hoping to find a treatment than it is a cautionary tale, showing how arduous it can be to turn promising research into real-life therapies when the market for them is too small. There are an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 rare diseases, said Dr. Matthew Porteus, president of the American Society for Cell and Gene Therapy and director of the Center for Definitive and Curative Medicine at Stanford. Developing a single drug tends to cost millions of dollars, assuming that patient advocates can even find someone to manufacture it and clinicians to run trials on it. But, Dr. Porteus said, the science is there. It's a huge challenge, and although Ms. Nazar succeeded, you shouldn't have to be a force of nature to get this going. Ms. Nazar was born in 1978 in Dubai. From the start, it was clear she was a sickly baby. She didn't crawl, her bones were bent, and her head and eyes were disproportionately large. Her father, Karim, was an engineer from India who devoted himself to helping his daughter, making custom leather shoes to fit her distorted feet, and carrying her up and down the stairs at her school. He spent all his savings caring for her and trying to find out what was wrong. He took his daughter to doctors in England and the US who placed pins in her bones in fruitless attempts to straighten them. At 3 years old, she underwent her first of several dozen surgeries. In 2004, when she was 26, she met a Nebraskan man, Adam Tim, online. 2 years later, they were married. Told she would never be able to have children, she and her husband were surprised when she became pregnant and gave birth to a 9-pound baby boy, Arshan Adam. He seemed fine for 2 years, then his bones began bending. He had the same condition as his mother. That's when we, my father and I, began sending my x-rays around the world to specialists in bone disorders, Ms. Nazar said. The few who replied said, no, we've never seen anything like this. Ms. Nazar would go on to have another son, Jahan Adam, with the same condition as well. She was starting to despair when her father came across a newspaper story that mentioned a pediatric geneticist in India who was diagnosing people with very strange symptoms. He wanted Ms. Nazar to meet her. When they arrived at the office of Dr. Sheila Namboothiri in Kerala on a sweltering August day in 2010, she took one look at Ms. Nazar and her x-rays and said, I know what you have. Years ago, Dr. Namboothiri took a course in Germany on skeletal dysplasias. The class's professor showed the students a slide of a patient with Jansen's disease, saying you can safely skip this slide as you're unlikely to encounter a patient with it during your career. To confirm the diagnosis, Dr. Namboothiri said in a recent interview, she got in touch with Dr. Harold Yupner, chief of pediatric nephrology at Massachusetts General Hospital, who discovered the disease's mutation in 1993. Around that time, Dr. Yupner read a medical article that mentioned a patient who was very short and had misshapen bones and high levels of calcium in her blood and urine. He had never heard of Jansen's disease, but reasoned correctly that the patient might have a mutation in a gene he had studied, PTH1R, which controls bone growth and calcium levels. Not long after, his colleague, Dr. Thomas Gardella, discovered a peptide that could turn off that gene, correcting the genetic defect. Dr. Gardella published his work in 1996 and then went on to other projects. 17 years later, Dr. Nanfothiri sent Dr. Yupner Ms. Nizar and her son's DNA. She was right, they had Jansen's. After learning of Dr. Yupner's work, Ms. Nizar was determined to meet him. She emailed him and said she was coming to the US. I was on a mission, she said. By searching the NIH website, she discovered that every year on February 28th, the NIH holds a rare disease day. Patients and advocates sit at tables where researchers and company representatives can stop and talk with them. She decided that she had to be there, and she told Dr. Yupner she was coming. He said he'd meet her there. Ms. Nizar secured a table, but with no time to prepare an elaborate exhibit, she merely displayed pictures of her sons and their x-rays, along with some scientific figures. She also played a PowerPoint presentation. At that time, she knew of only one other person besides herself and her sons who had the disease. I remember one person came by and said, 4 people? No one's going to care about 4 people, she recalled. She was crestfallen until Dr. Yupner arrived. He told her that Dr. Gardella's peptide might work to treat Jansen's. But at that point, it was just basic lab research. To take it to the next stage, they needed funding. Dr. Yupner and Dr. Gardella first got a small grant from the drug company Sanofi, followed by a research grant from the NIH. Their drug, the previously discovered peptide, seemed to work in the laboratory and in mice that had been given the Jansen's mutation. A university lab, however, is not capable of carrying out clinical trials with human patients. We looked around and said, what do we do now? They can only go so far. After digging into the possibilities, she discovered the NIH's National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. Founded in 2011, the center develops potential therapies for rare diseases that would not interest drug companies, harnessing new possibilities that have sprung from the genomic revolution, which has allowed scientists to pinpoint likely therapies far more quickly than before. But even given the tools available, funding a drug for a condition that affects just hundreds of people, let alone mere dozens, can be difficult to justify. At her initial meeting with the NIH Center in 2018, Ms. Nizar got the impression that the staff was not enthusiastic about developing a peptide to treat Jansen's disease. Even so, she made her pitch. It's such a small ask from your team, she implored. You don't have to manufacture so much. There aren't that many patients. Then somebody got up from the audience, she recalled saying. Then somebody got up from the audience, she recalled, saying, this is so doable. I don't know why we wouldn't do it. This is how Ms. Nizar ended up as patient number 1 in a clinical trial, undergoing weekly treatments with the peptide drug throughout the summer. She will return to the NIH in September, continuing to test doses of the drug to track its effects on her parathyroid hormone levels. When researchers find the optimal dose for her, the study will then be expanded to include her children and see if the peptide halts their disease. If it does, said Dr. Alison Boyce, the study's principal investigator, it will be transformative in Jansen's. Dr. Boyce added that the drug might also help patients with kidney failure by lowering dangerously high levels of parathyroid hormone. Patients with another condition, hyperparathyroidism, could also benefit. The current treatment is to remove their parathyroid glands. Ms. Nizar was really a driving force in getting this study going, said Dr. Gardella. It's a profoundly devastating disease, but Ms. Nizar, he said, has a great attitude and is really brave. Even though it can be frustrating and unfair to expect people with ultra-rare diseases to take active roles in pushing research forward and getting clinical trials started, Ms. Nizar said she wanted her story to be hopeful. You know, so many times we're given the diagnosis and we're saying nothing can be done, she said. And that's just not true. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And now a frightening article. More U.S. parents opting children out of vaccine requirements, CDC reports. By Teddy Rosenbluth, Danny Blum, and Francesca Paris. At a time when measles and other potentially deadly diseases are spreading, more American children are receiving exemptions allowing them to attend school without the routine childhood shots that can protect against those illnesses. Roughly 4% of kindergartners in the United States were given a non-medical exemption for at least one vaccine during the 2025-26 school year, an 18% jump from the previous year, according to new data released on Monday by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That rise, the largest annual increase recorded in more than a decade, comes as a growing number of states look to loosen vaccine mandates or even do away with them entirely. Exemption rates vary dramatically by state. While all states allow students to opt out of vaccine requirements for certain medical conditions, some also allow exemptions for religious or personal reasons. In Utah, which has some of the most relaxed laws around school vaccine requirements, nearly 13% of kindergartners had a religious or personal exemption for at least one routine shot. The state is also in the midst of a months-long measles outbreak that has infected more than 700 people. New York, which stopped allowing parents to opt out for religious reasons in 2019, reported no non-medical exemptions. The new data have deepened concern among public health experts that American communities are losing the levels of immunity needed to protect against a number of highly contagious diseases. The findings were released a week after Trump issued an executive order calling for children to get fewer vaccines. While the executive order cannot force states to change their vaccine policies, it was the latest in a series of actions by the administration that experts have warned are likely to undermine confidence in vaccine safety. Vaccination rates among U.S. kindergartners dropped slightly during the 25-26 school year, falling by 0.1 percentage points from the previous year. Even small dips in vaccination rates can leave the nation vulnerable to highly contagious diseases like measles, said Sean O'Leary, a member of the Infectious Disease Committee at the American Academy of Pediatrics. The country is in the midst of the worst year for measles in recent history. As the virus continues to spread through pockets of under-vaccinated people around the United States. Dr. O'Leary said, even though these drops in the last couple of years have been relatively small, they're meaningful. They are leading us to have diseases that we really should not see here in the U.S. In a statement, the Department of Health and Human Services said that the CDC continues to encourage parents to discuss vaccination options with their doctor. The gap between a large increase in exemptions and only a minor decline in vaccinations could be at least partially explained by the fact that there were fewer children this school year whose vaccination status was unknown. During the pandemic, the share of children with missing records, meaning those who had neither a vaccination record nor an exemption on file, shot up. But more families now seem to be filing formal exemptions, leading the number to rise more dramatically than the vaccination rate has fallen. Vaccination rates have been declining in the U.S. for years. They fell during the COVID-19 pandemic as routine immunizations were disrupted and as mistrust in the medical establishment grew, and they have not yet rebounded. Still, the new data show that childhood vaccination rates remain high overall. About 92% of kindergartners receive routine vaccinations for diseases like measles, pertussis, and polio. Said Jason Schwartz, an associate professor of health policy at the Yale School of Public Health, despite everything we've seen around vaccines over the past several years, the large majority of parents continue to support vaccines and continue to vaccinate their children. Public health researchers noted that while a vast majority of parents are still vaccinating their children, there are places within the U.S. where rates are far lower than 92%. That includes in places like Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Spartanburg County, South Carolina, both at the center of large measles outbreaks this year. The rise in exemptions from vaccine mandates is a dangerous trend, said Dr. Walter Orenstein, the former director of the National Immunization Program at the CDC. Vaccines are victims of their own success, he said, and we're beginning to see that even more. And here's an interesting editorial, guest essay. At least I think it's interesting. I hope you will. I let my students watch me struggle with a masterpiece. It changed everything. And this is by Matt Deenan, who is the director of the Great Books program at St. Thomas University in New Brunswick. I read The Brothers Karamazov for the first time last semester. For someone in my line of work, I'm a professor in a Great Books program, having failed to read one of the greatest novels ever written is embarrassingly close to professional malpractice. So when my co-teacher, Alan, proposed we assign this 1,000-page saga to our third and fourth year students, I eagerly agreed. The Brothers Karamazov consumed me in a way I hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. I could think of little else. Emails went unanswered. I repeatedly read well past my strict middle-aged 10 p.m. bedtime. I was once so absorbed, I forgot to pick up my daughter at ballet. I lost interest in my phone. And I wasn't alone. As my profession underwent a large and public meltdown over the future of education in the AI age, I was having one of the best semesters of my career. When I'd enter our seminar room, I'd hear my students chattering excitedly about Dmitry Karamazov's wild love life and self-destructive partying, as if he lived in the dorm with them. There were debates, wrong-headed in my view, but sincere, about which books might help the obdurate intellectual brother Ivan overcome his despair. That my students, regular 20-somethings at a public college in one of Canada's poorest provinces, fell in love with Dostoevsky's strange little town might look like a miracle from the outside. But as the narrator of the book puts it, miracles never bother a realist. To be a realist about higher education is to acknowledge that the challenge of our moment is not primarily intellectual, but sentimental, spiritual, if you will. In the algorithmic age, effective teaching is affective teaching. Today's educational problems are often attributed to a deficit of focus or attention, but attention is an anemic way to understand what allows education to transform people. We're really talking about passion, inconvenient and unfashionable as that is to acknowledge. Passion creates a unity of purpose and urgency that is the antidote to the feckless, superficial distraction of the algorithmic age. Lots of us pay very close attention to our phones, but what we lack is the sustaining passion that endures difficulty and shapes a life. And I apologize again for this beeping. When I asked my students why they thought Dostoevsky was such a hit, they routinely said two things. First, they were moved by the passions of the characters in the novel. As one student put it, the characters in The Brothers Karamazov approach life head first, heels last. They dash to extremity, grab what's there, and bring it back to this otherwise insignificant village where it explodes into fierce little human dramas that take on cosmic significance. The novel is an extravagant convergence of form and content in this sense. It shows us what real, life-shaping passion looks like, but also awakens something similar in its readers. Second, the students explained that my own enthusiasm helped stoke theirs. When I asked how they were managing to keep up with the brisk pace of the reading assignments, one of them candidly said, "Well, it really helps that you're so into it." Since Alan knew much more about the novel than I did and mostly led discussions, I had the pleasure of becoming a student myself, proposing thrilling but wildly unscholarly theories about the ultimate fate of Father Zosima or the motivations of the novel's mysterious narrator. As far back as Plato's irascible character Meno, would-be teachers have been confronting the problem that students must want to learn before learning is possible. For many decades, higher education has relied on a workaround to this problem, tying access to good jobs to success in school. In some cases, a desire for money and prestige leads to real, if incidental, learning. But large language models have broken this arrangement by making it possible for students to skip straight to an effortless A without doing any meaningful learning. Technology has exposed the limits of our mercenary approach to education. Over the course of last semester, I became convinced there is a way out of this moribund strategy. We teachers must remain students and model what we want to see. We need to recover the passion that drove us to our books, to the lab. We need to embody love of learning for its own sake against the pervasive message that higher education should be vocational, and we need to clarify the basic questions that make our subjects worth studying. Keeping a certain youthful enthusiasm or undergraduate idiosyncrasy is difficult when you're contending with daycare colds, spirit-rending administrative work, worries about the state of the world and the future, or simply the kind of routinized structure that bear the weight of bourgeois life. Being a good teacher requires being sort of odd, even a bit immature. Some of my favorite professors married scholarly expertise with considerable eccentricity. My dissertation advisor insisted her students take up social dance like polka, line dancing, and zydeco. Another of my former professors would alight at 4 a.m. to teach himself Japanese before undertaking woodworking projects like making a life-size chess sets. The passions are nonconformist. To be moved is to be a little bit weird. What I discovered in you in my encounter with the Brothers K last term was that if you want students to be passionately engaged, not worried about the future, grasping careerist or disengaged, you must transmit the spark of passion in your deeds, in your soul. If you expect your students to choose books, ideas, and genuine learning over shortcuts and distraction, you must be a bit courageous too. Get back to the basics. Cut through the haze of abstraction, the webs of scholarly terminology, the pretense of professionalization and attempts to recover the basic human experiences that can move us. Remain a student in earnest. Near the end of Brothers K, the novel's hero, the youngest brother, Alyosha, is trying to win over an intelligent boy named Kolya who confuses skepticism with maturity. Alyosha's passionate appeal doesn't involve rhetorical fireworks or hysterics. Instead, he takes the young man very seriously. He treats him like an adult. We forget at our peril how life-changing it can be for young people to have an unrelated adult treat them with seriousness and respect. Alyosha is present to Kolya and painfully earnest. For the most part, he asks questions rather than gives speeches. And eventually, Kolya can't deny that there is something about Karamazov abandoning his prematurely world-weary cynicism for a more expansive embrace of life. As educators the world over look toward the coming school year, perhaps with a hint of dread, we should focus on what we can control. The challenges of our algorithmic age are real, but it has always been true that good teachers need to be exemplary students to help others learn. For Dostoevsky, worldly common sense can make us unwitting fools. As Alyosha memorably notes, all capable people are awfully afraid of looking ridiculous, and it makes them unhappy. Remaining a passionate student yourself may well feel ridiculous nowadays, but it is ultimately nothing more than realism about what education requires. Now I'll editorialize for a minute. That's a good essay, and that's what I used to do in my teaching, or try to. And I think so many people miss it in this age of mechanized education. Okay, end of editorial. And here's another piece on a similar subject. This is the solution to America's literacy crisis, and it's a lot of fun. And this is by Peter Schmidt, who is the program director of the Struthers School of Radical Attention, whatever that is. If you've read the news lately, or more likely heard it, watched it, or spied half a headline on your friend's Instagram feed, you've been told that literacy is doomed. High school seniors are reading at the lowest levels in over 20 years, and college students don't know how to read a book cover to cover. There's plenty to mourn in these developments, but as an English syllabus fixture of yore might have said, reports of literacy's death are greatly exaggerated. Having come of age amid COVID-19 lockdowns and the proliferation of social media, young people crave the forms of human connection that teach us to live in the world we actually inhabit, not the one we see on screen. Asking questions, thinking together, and beholding the strangeness of the reality passed down to us. As it happens, books are uniquely powerful objects around which to organize these sorts of activities. That's why the act of engaging with written texts the basis of our cultural, political, and intellectual life for over 500 years, is not coming to an end. It's changing to meet new needs by offering the kinds of experiences digital technologies can provide, synchronous IRL encounters with other human beings. In other words, the future of reading is a party. Books are bringing people together. Gen Z reading groups are popping up across the United States, and the Silent Book Club, a community that gathers for silent reading, now has over 2,000 chapters across 68 countries. Reading retreats and summer camps hosted by the Bad Bitch Book Club regularly convene between 15 and 90 enthusiasts for week-long getaways, giving new meaning to the term escapist literature. Sally Mercedes, the events coordinator at Magic City Books in Tulsa, Oklahoma, sees bookstores playing an increasingly social function for their customers. A lot of bookish people tend to be introverts, she told me. We need a space where we know that we're on common ground with others. Other experiments are remixing the traditional book club format or breaking out of it entirely. Quick pause, you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The Consumption Book Club, a literary and culinary event series organized by the Gen Z artists Colette Estelle and Kyle Barnes, brings to life works such as Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation via meticulously themed dinner parties and facilitated conversations. A recent public reading of Allen Ginsberg's Howl, organized by 20-somethings, drew hundreds of people to Washington Square Park in New York City. The Strother School of Radical Attention, where I work, helps to gather groups over a dozen times a month in 6 states for sidewalk study, a practice of reading and enacting long-form texts while moving through public space. These gatherings vary in location, duration, and subject matter, but their unifying spirit is simple, that reading can be as much a mode of vibrant sociality as it is of secluded interiority. Easy as it is to forget, sitting alone and reading in silence, the activity the professors tend to worry about, was once a novelty. In his Confessions, Augustine of Hippo relates stumbling upon Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, in a moment of perplexing absorption. This is a quote from St. Augustine. While reading, his eyes glanced over the pages and his heart searched out the sense, but his voice and tongue were silent. That Augustine bothered to describe this scene tells us something about the way reading commonly took place in the ancient world, as a public practice, recited before groups of lettered and unlettered listeners alike. He doesn't mention this, but also people read out loud to themselves. They heard rather than read silently the way we do. Herodotus is thought to have read portions of his histories aloud, and performative recitaciones of written texts were a favored form of entertainment and debate in imperial Rome. The practice of reading in and for groups endured in modern times in spaces of religious worship, workers' study groups, and avant-garde literary performances. But the spread of the printed word and the subsequent democratization of literacy cemented solitary, silent absorption as the dominant image of the reading person. This is the kind of reading we're taught to do in school. It's also the kind of reading that students are now failing to do in ever greater numbers. Why? There's no denying that young people are suffering from the harms of smartphone use and cognitive outsourcing to artificial intelligence. These are serious problems. But they're only half the story. Students understand as well as anyone else that long-form text is no longer the exclusive or even the most effective tool for distributing knowledge, connecting people across time and space, and coordinating complex decisions. We're in a moment of eclipse. The informational function of books is declining, and their experiential function is coming to the fore. This shift can bring new vitality not only to the lives of readers, but also to long-form texts themselves. Engaging with books as instruments for group experience is not the sort of reading that we encounter in classrooms, but it has plenty to teach us about the complexities of inhabiting the world together and the ways that our literary inheritance can prepare us for the challenge. While educators may never abandon traditional instruction in solitary reading, right now they face an enormous opportunity to impart a new vision for the role of literacy in public life. Last month, I helped to organize one of these gatherings in Dumbo, that's down under the something Manhattan Borough overpass, I think, on the Brooklyn waterfront. An all-night group recitation of Walt Whitman's Song of Myself on the eve of the poet's 207th birthday. We had 25 RSVPs, but swelled by plus ones and walk-ins, ended up with closer to 50 people in attendance. 2 or 3 older Whitman enthusiasts joined us, but nearly all of the other people seemed to be in their 20s. After 4 hours of recitation, singing, repetition, call and response, and countless other experimental reading methods, we decamped to the shore of the East River where around 2 a.m. we let out a full-throated collective yawp. In the breathless quiet that followed, a recent college graduate standing beside me admitted that she had never even read Whitman before. Several nodding heads assured her she wasn't the only one. Then, emboldened by the company, she proposed, "Let's do it again." And some letters to the editor. Here's one from Mount Laurel, New Jersey, writing about an article called "Kennedy Center Board Votes to Inscribe Trump's Name on the Building." With respect to the board's decision to inscribe "Restored and Renovated by President Donald J. Trump" on the Kennedy Center, I would ask 2 things. First, as a trial of the public's acceptance of this kind of recognition, ensure that similar signs be placed around the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. Second, make sure that the restoration and renovation are actually completed before adding this signage to the Kennedy Center. That might guarantee that there will be a new president of the United States in place to ensure its removal. Another letter on the same subject, this time from British Columbia. Those proposing to inscribe "Restored and Renovated by President Donald J. Trump" on the Kennedy Center should consider that restored and renovated are in the past tense. Therefore, they should not be inscribed until the work is in the past, that is, completed. What if the Kennedy Center were renovated to the same shoddy standards and at the wildly over-budget costs as other recent efforts by Trump? The reflecting pool comes to mind. The Kennedy Center board and Trump himself might then reflect upon whether he would really want his name associated with the final result. In another letter, this one from California, doesn't the Kennedy Center's board realize that Trump's name is an anathema to a vast majority of people in the arts, which is why so many performers decline to work there? The Trump name is becoming synonymous with boorish taste and corruption, and the board wants to engrave that on the building? And one from St. Louis. Because the American people will be paying for what the Kennedy Center board calls Trump's contributions to the survival of the center, the inscription, if there must be one, should read, "Restored and Renovated by the American People." And here's an article, and a letter called "A Slogan for the Democrats." Here is a slogan for the Democrats to use as the midterms approach. Donald Trump is $2 billion richer since he took office again. How is your family doing? Add a picture of him smirking, and you're done. No need for endless caveats, policy wonkish descents into the weeds, or preaching. And one final letter. This is in response to an article called "A Russia-Ukraine Peace Deal is Now Possible." Thomas Graham argues that the time is right for immediate U.S. re-engagement to end the war. Mr. Graham's argument leaves out the fact that there is zero evidence that President Vladimir Putin of Russia is interested in ending the war that he launched unless the U.S. pressures Ukraine into surrendering its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. By ending direct military assistance to Ukraine last year, the current U.S. administration has forfeited much of its leverage over Ukraine. That the American negotiators Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have visited Russia numerous times but have yet to set foot in Ukraine undermines their credibility with the Ukrainians, though they are reported to be planning a visit to Kyiv sometime soon. The best way to end the war is by not engaging in wishful thinking, but by providing significant military assistance to Ukraine, including the urgently needed interceptor missiles, and by tightening sanctions on Russia. And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to speaking to you next week. Bye.